As we get started today, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about my story, a story that I think many of you probably know at this point. But for me, as many of you know, kind of most of my life, most of my adult life, I wasn't really interested in faith, wasn't interested in religion, didn't care about any of those things, kind of thought they were pretty silly, quite honestly. It's interesting because I had actually grown up in a Christian household, but by the time I got to be an adult, I just couldn't buy into what I had been taught as a kid. I just could not believe those things that I had been taught. So, of course, the healthy thing to do is when you struggle with part of something, you just drop the whole thing, right? And that's kind of what I did. But then in my 40s, things began to change a little bit. This week, as we wrap up Creating Influence, the series we're in, I want to look at a point that is demonstrated incredibly clearly by my friend's Daryl's life. Is that as we talk about this idea of moral influence and being connected into people's lives that we care about, it's never too late. Because recall that last week as we launched the series, we talked about two kinds of authority, right? That there's positional authority and moral authority. And both of these kinds of authority give us influence, right? The positional authority is the kind of authority we generally think about, right? Is that when someone has a role or a position, they're a manager in a job, they lead a team, right? They're an officer in the military, even someone who's an umpire or a referee in a sporting event, right? Those people have influence kind of automatically because of the position that they hold. But positional authority alone is quite limited because positional authority means that your reach and your influence are limited to what people believe they have to do because of the role or position that you're in. Moral authority is actually much bigger than that. Moral authority is the authority that we all really want. That's the kind of influence that we want. Because moral authority has nothing to do with moralism. Moral authority is that we live our lives in such a way and we conduct ourselves in such a way that people start to trust us and they start to look to us and they start to want to be in relationship with us. And they allow us into their lives and they become part of our lives and we become able to have influence in their lives. Now, the thing is that in order to have moral authority, it's something we have to live up to. And the thing about moral authority is it's kind of this kind of up and down thing. And as we talked about last week is that the thing that's great about moral authority is that we can build it steadily over time. The challenge is, though, is that it can fall apart on us. If we suddenly kind of just lose control of our lives, it could very quickly undo all that. But ideally, it's something that is built over a lifetime. But what if your lifetime, what if my lifetime has not been lived in a way consistent with moral authority? Because we all have periods in our lives where we don't quite live the way we'd like to. It might be like my friend Daryl, and actually like for much of my life, was that work came before everything. And it damages our relationships, and it can destroy relationships. Or maybe you just have a point in your life where you just kind of have this meltdown where you're really depressed or anxiety takes over or you just can't engage with anyone, you just can't stand to be around people right now. And those sort of things do damage. Or things like alcohol and substance that just get a hold of us. I mean, they just we can't reason our way out of those things. And that starts to damage our relationships. So what happens if you've had one of those kind of moments in your life? That there's something that's kind of blown all that up. And now you find yourself wherever you are. You're 30 years old, you're 50 years old, you're 70 years old. What do you do then? You have not spent your whole lifetime building up moral authority. You have not done what it takes to have those strong relationships. What do? Well, that's one of the powers of moral authority. It's something that we build over time. And we can start building it at any point in our lives. It's never too late. I mean, something that's so important to remember is that any journey that we take, whatever it is, it starts from wherever we are, right? So any point in our lives, we can begin a journey towards rebuilding relationships, to building what we call our moral authority. But really that comes down to having relationships and influence in the lives of people we care about. There's always an opportunity to rebuild our moral authority or continue to build it. It comes down to how we live out our lives, and it comes down to how we treat the people around us, and it comes down to how much we value the people around us. Now, as we think about all those issues, I wanted to actually look at kind of two very different people who have encounters with Jesus. They each have their own individual encounter with Jesus. And the first person we meet is someone that we would expect to have tremendous moral authority. And then the second person we meet, we would expect to have virtually none. But after each of these men's encounter with Jesus, we find that the tables start to turn a little bit, that their influence ends up in a different place than we might have expected. Now, these accounts actually come to us from the gospel writer Luke. Now, remember, what Luke set out to do was provide a thorough documentation of the events around Jesus' life. And it's always so important to remember that when Luke was writing the document we call the Gospel of Luke, he wasn't writing the Bible. There wouldn't be a Bible for another couple hundred years. All Luke wanted to do was write down a document that recorded all these things that had happened. And so he tells us about what he found as he kind of did the research, as he talked to the people that were there. In this one account he tells us about, says, once a religious leader asked Jesus this question, "Good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" So now this guy is a religious leader, right? The Greek word says that he is a leader, a man of status, is what it actually tells us. Now, he is likely a person, because of his position, that people come to and look to him for authority. Because remember that the nation of Israel in the first century was kind of a theocracy, right? In the sense that they actually looked at their government and their religion as kind of the same thing. But they'd also been conquered by a foreign government, Rome. Right? So these religious leaders were these people who sat kind of above the people inside of Israel, but were ultimately under the Roman authorities, the pagans. But because of his position, people would seek out his opinion, people would come talk to him. If he talked, people would listen. And it seems very likely that this guy would consider himself someone with tremendous moral authority. I mean, would all these people come and talk to me if I didn't have great moral authority? That's what he would certainly think. If we look at that greeting where it says, "Good teacher," that's not a normal greeting. Good teacher is a very flamboyant, over-the-top greeting. Now, why would he do that? Well, there was something that traveled with Jesus all the time. You know what that was? Crowds. Jesus was always surrounded by a crowd. And so what's happening here is that this guy, this religious leader, looks on and he sees this crowd around Jesus, and Jesus is getting all this attention. But I'm the religious guy around here. And so what he's doing by saying, "Good teacher," he's basically flamboyantly stepping into the crowd. Look at me, here I am. But then he does actually ask a very realistic question, right? What must I do to inherit eternal life? So Jesus replies to that question. He says, to answer your question, you know the commandments. You must not commit adultery. You must not murder. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely. Honor your father and mother. So he goes through the 10 commandments, but as you'll see, there's not 10 items up there. There's fewer than 10. So Jesus has chosen to use a specific subset of the commandments, and they don't even go in order. So why is he choosing this subset? What's he doing? Well, remember that the 10 commandments are actually broken into two categories. One category of commandments were about our relationship with God. What are the things we're supposed to do to be in relationship with God? The other category of commandments are how we relate to other people, how we interact to other people. Things like, don't commit adultery, don't murder, right? Don't steal, don't testify falsely, honor your father and mother. Those are about our relationship with other people. So he's going through the commandments. Jesus is going through the subset of the commandments. But what he's actually asking the guy is, not, do you follow the letter of the law? Can you interpret that as narrowly as you possibly can? and say that you're doing well? What Jesus is saying is, how well do you treat other people? How hard do you work to care for other people? How willing are you to use what you have to make a difference in the lives of other people? That's the question that Jesus is asking this man. But this guy is so busy showing off, he doesn't hear that. Because his motive from the moment he walked into this conversation was basically to get Jesus to validate how good this religious leader is. Basically, he's walking to the conversation going, look, I know I'm good. You know I'm good. Let's just make sure everyone else around here knows I'm good. That's his motive for walking into this conversation. Basically, just to get Jesus to confirm in front of everyone how good this religious leader is. Now, as Jesus asks that question or makes that statement, the gentleman responds, well, I've obeyed all these commandments since I was young. See, I'm good. I've done all this. And based on that response, it certainly sounds like the man's a saint. But that's fairly unlikely. Right? Because of this structure that I talked about, where you had kind of the everyday people, this thin layer of religious leaders, and then the government of Rome. Many times, these people in these religious leadership positions, they use their position to benefit themselves. Because the way Rome does things is Rome's not really interested that much in interacting with the little people. They just want people to stay in line. Basically, that was the number one requirement of anyone governing under Rome. If you have any riots, we're sending in the centurions and we'll kill them all. But if you keep them in line, Rome says just do what you want. And so what the religious leaders would often do is they would get directives from Rome about things that needed to happen. And the religious leaders would come up with religious reasons why those things had to happen. They would actually manipulate the system. And they would also often come up with reasons why people had to pay extra money for things. And then the religious leaders would take that money and line their own pockets. But as they were doing all that, this gentleman says that I'm not guilty of stealing. I'm not guilty of testifying falsely, because he's trying to use the narrowest interpretation as he can. And that was never Jesus' intent. That was never God's intent. Right? These were meant to guide us on how to care for and interact with other people. But as this guy says that I've always done this since I was young, right? Jesus isn't falling for it. Because nobody is as perfect as this guy says he is. Oh, except for one, the one he's talking to right now. Right? Jesus knows what it takes to live life that way. And Jesus knew that no one other than him could do it. But one of the things I love about Jesus, you hear me say this a lot, that Jesus is like this masterful communicator. Right? Because, there might have been this temptation to get into this guy's face and be like, liar, nuh-uh, right? But Jesus doesn't do it that way. Jesus says, oh, okay, that's great. So when Jesus heard his answer, he said, well, there's still one thing you haven't done. Sell all your possessions, give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. But when the man heard this, he became very sad, for he was very rich. And what that tells us is that in his position, to have become very rich means he was doing the sort of things that I had described. Now, what Jesus is really saying here is that, well, if you really care about people like you claim you do, well then all that money is getting in your way, right? Use that money to really change things, to really make people's lives better. Give it to those who really need it. And then follow me. But the man wouldn't do that because he was afraid of losing his wealth, and honestly, he was afraid of losing the status that came with his position. But now, as we look at this narrative and we see what Jesus says to this guy about, give all your stuff away, it's really important to note that nowhere else is it recorded of Jesus saying that to anyone. This is the only place where it's recorded where Jesus says, sell all your stuff. So what Jesus isn't saying here, he's not saying that, well, to be my follower, you can't have any stuff, you got to sell everything. What he's saying is, if you're my follower, if you're living according to the way God wants us to live, you have your priorities in order. And our priorities are about caring for people, using what we have to help people when we can. Right? Something we've talked about a ton, right? Is that if you see a need you can meet it. But what Jesus wanted to demonstrate here, he's actually making kind of this very broad statement, or I should say a very narrow statement to make a broad point. He tells this guy, you need to sell everything. What he's really saying is, our position, in other words, when we have high-ranking position, and that can be a relative term, or when we have resources, position and resources can fool us into believing that we're people focused. They can fool us into believing that we actually have moral authority. Because with our position, people will automatically follow us. In this guy's case, he had a very high position, so people kind of had to listen to him. But he had convinced himself that people wanted to listen to him. At the same time, when we have resources, we might choose to do small things that help out a little and convince ourselves that we're doing really big things. And what Jesus is simply saying is, we need to be willing to really step out and care for people. And in this guy's case, once caring for people started to cost him something, he wasn't really interested in doing it. And so what we find is, this religious leader, when we first meet him, appears to have a great deal of moral authority. But when put to a single test, it appears, or it demonstrated, that he actually has very little moral authority. Now that's the religious leader. That's the guy I said that we would meet that would start out looking like he had a great deal of moral authority. But now let's look at another person. As we look at this other person, we'll meet them as they encounter Jesus while Jesus is out traveling one day. And as we'll see that things go incredibly different for this man. So again, Jesus is out traveling, and he comes into a new city. And as he approaches the city, there was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region. And he had become very rich. Now, if you've been in church for any length of time, you know how tax collectors make their money. Tax collectors have authority given to them by Rome, but they're Jewish people. And they're Jewish people who collect taxes from their own people, in other words, take money from their own people to give to Rome. Now, that alone made them appear to be traitors. But the way Rome does things is consistent. As we've talked about, when I talked about the religious leader, as long as those religious leaders kept the people under control, Rome didn't care how they did it. Well, when it comes to tax collecting, Rome says, this is how much money we expect from those people. Get it any way you can and take as much as you want. As long as we get what we expect, you can do what you want. And so what tax collectors did is they didn't just collect the taxes that were owed. They collected a whole bunch of extra money and used it to line their pockets. So what they did was they used the authority that they had because Rome allowed them to have the authority, and they used that to steal from their own people. But now, that's what the tax collectors did, and this is where Zacchaeus is at. But as Jesus enters the town, Zacchaeus really wants to see him, because what always traveled with Jesus? A crowd. And there was one really important feature of Zacchaeus. If you were in Sunday school years ago, you would know this because there's a song about it. Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. In other words, he was small in stature. That's what the song says anyway. But it actually is true. The Bible tells us that Zacchaeus was small in stature. He was short. But it goes on to tell us that he was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. That's as close as I get to singing, by the way. So he climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. Right? And so it's a terrible song, right? It's like a terrible song. Just kind of, I don't think that's politically correct. Right? But basically, right, is that if you think about it, he's this very wealthy man, but he's small in stature. And that's kind of important because what it tells us is he wants to see as Jesus goes by so much, he's actually kind of willing to humiliate himself. Right? Because a person of wealth at that time would have worn very large garments, like great big robes that kind of go all the way to the ground, lots of ornamentation. And as a smaller person, what that means is he's going to try and scramble up this tree. He would have looked quite silly doing it. And chances are, people would have been laughing at him while he did it. But he didn't care because he really wanted to see Jesus walking by. So as Zacchaeus is up there now, up in the tree, just trying to see over the crowd, something amazing happens. As Jesus walks by, he stops. And he looks up. And he goes to Zacchaeus, "Come down. I want to go to your house for dinner tonight." And that would have been unimaginable. But Zacchaeus is so excited because we're told Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement. Now, compare this to the religious leader. Right? Both the religious leader and Zacchaeus approached Jesus in a crowd. The religious leader was there entirely for himself, to show off, to be validated, to validate how big and important he is. But Zacchaeus is different. Zacchaeus was willing to humiliate himself just to get a glimpse of Jesus. And then Jesus invites him to talk to him, and he is joyful about that because he just wants to get a chance to spend time alone with Jesus. But as excited as Zacchaeus is, he does have a reputation. It says, but the people were displeased. Jesus has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Because no one liked Zacchaeus. Because he worked for Rome, right? And he was lining his pockets with their money. And they weren't happy about that. So their question is that a guy like this, why is Jesus even wasting his time with this man? Because Zacchaeus is up to no good. He is always up to no good, and he is never, ever going to change. That's what we're thinking. That's what they're thinking. But as we see, for Zacchaeus, this time with Jesus was precious, and it was important, and his motives were pure. Because Luke tells us that, meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. And if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." And you see the difference in the attitude between the religious leader and Zacchaeus by the greeting alone. The religious leader is like, "Good teacher," kind of like he's a peer, like, "Hey." Zacchaeus is like, "Lord, you govern my life. You show me the way forward. You show me how to live. You're the one who shows me how to make a difference." And as Zacchaeus goes on and as he talks, we realize that Jesus has had an impact in his life. Because again, Zacchaeus was a man with no moral authority, right? He had no influence because of the way he lived. The only influence he had was positional, right? That authority that was given to him by Rome. So people would do what they had to do. They'd give him the money he asked for, because if you didn't, he'd bring Rome in on you. But no one cared what he thought, because he used that authority to steal from the people and line his own pockets. Sounds like the other guy a little bit. The religious leader used that same Rome-granted authority to steal from his own people and line his pockets. The key difference is Zacchaeus eventually owned that what he was doing was wrong. And he decided to set it right. Right? Both the religious leader and Zacchaeus were wealthy men with positions that came with power. But the religious leader hid behind his position. Using his position, he would lie to himself that, "No, I am really important and I really am doing good things." And he would lie to the others around him. "See how good I am, see how good I do all the time." But Zacchaeus didn't have that option. There was nothing edifying about Zacchaeus' job. So everyone knew that there was no mistaking how broken his life was, that he was openly stealing from his own people. Now that sounds like a bad thing, but there's something that really important happens when our lives are broken to the point that we can't deny it. When our lives finally break to the point that we can't deny it, it actually gets a bit easier to admit that we need to change. For the religious leader, he was surrounded by a facade and an entire system that would prop him up and allow him to continue this lie on and on. Zacchaeus didn't do that. He saw that he needed to change. And change he did. And here's the thing that's so important. When he changed, he used actions to demonstrate that he changed. Because he took actions that prioritized people. He took action that started to repair the damage that he had done. And as Zacchaeus did that, as he took action to repair that damage, he was on the way to reestablishing his moral authority. He was on that way to being able to rebuild relationships. Or in his case, probably not rebuild, but build relationships from scratch. Because this is the thing that I'd like us all to remember, and I'd invite us all to kind of really think about this, is that we have all made mistakes. Right? We have all hurt people. And thankfully, we often do eventually change. But just changing is not enough to rebuild our relationships. Just changing is not enough to rebuild our moral authority. If we want to really rebuild our moral authority, we want to really rebuild our relationships, what we have to do is we also have to own the damage that we've created. We have hurt people along the way. And we have to own the fact that we've created the damage, and we have to do the best we can to repair the damage if we can. We get to this point sometimes where we've had, days, weeks, months, years of just blowing up our lives and blowing up the lives of people around us. And then one day we're like, oh, that's bad. I'm sorry. But we have to do more than say, I'm sorry. I mean, imagine Zacchaeus. If Zacchaeus would have, after talking to Jesus, said, oh man, this is all wrong. I'm going to stop overcharging people. And Zacchaeus then said to everybody, I'm sorry. And he didn't do anything else. What good would that do? What good would that do for all the people that he had previously hurt? I mean, honestly, why would anyone even believe him? The day he did that, he'd walk out and they'd be like, oh, I guess Zacchaeus had a crisis of conscience, right? But you know what? Next month will be the same as he always was, right? Just saying sorry is too cheap. It's too easy. When we've hurt people, we need to own it and we need to step into it. And that's what Zacchaeus did. Because what did he do? Well, he invested half his resources in those who need it. That stood out. That showed that he was changing. And he gave back not just what he took, but 4 times what he took. That stood out. Because he was recognizing that when he took the money, he did more damage than just what he did in that one transaction. He may have taken all their money, leaving them hurting for months. So he did the best he could to take his ill-gotten gains, in his case, and help those that he'd hurt, as well as many others. Basically, what Zacchaeus did was exactly what Jesus had suggested the religious leader do. But as far as we know, Jesus never asked Zacchaeus to do that. He realized what he had done, and he used the resources he had to start repairing things. And so what that shows us is that for the religious leader who refused to even acknowledge what Jesus said to him. I mean, imagine if Jesus would have said, sell everything you have and follow me. And the guy said, yeah, that's a lot. But what if I do this, I take care of these people, I've hurt these people, I'll address that. That would have been like, wow, you're on the road. Okay, great. Do that. But his refusal to even take the first step, his refusal to even acknowledge what he had done, shows that his position and his resources were more important to him than people and relationships. Where Zacchaeus put that entirely on its head. Zacchaeus showed that he valued relationships and he valued people. So as we prepare to wrap up, the thing that I would like us all to see, and we see this in Zacchaeus' life, and we see this in the life of my friend Darrell that I talked about at the beginning of the message. Although moral authority and our relationships and our influence in the lives of people around us are things that are built over time, ideally over a lifetime. But nobody's lifetime is perfect. But it's never too late to start. Because the thing that's so important to remember is that what makes moral authority special is you cannot demand a moral authority. In fact, as soon as you demand it, it's not moral authority anymore. Moral authority is granted. People see our lives, see how we treat them, see how we treat others, and people grant us moral authority. They invite us into their lives. And people do that one person at a time. And so, I think if we each look at our lives, the people we most would like to have moral authority with, those kind of close, influential relationships with, are people like our coworkers, our friends, our family, right? They're the people we really want that. But here's the thing. They're also the same people that we're most likely to have hurt. Because they're the people we're closest to. But then we kind of get into this cycle because they're the people we're most likely to have hurt because we're so close to them. But because we're so close to them, it's really hard for us to admit what we've done. It gets really hard to make those admissions. And that's a key thing that keeps us from developing moral authority with particularly our families and being active in the lives of the people in our families in a meaningful way, is an unwillingness to admit the hurt we've caused and an unwillingness to take action to repair that hurt. Because it's all too easy to convince ourselves that, well, yeah, I did those things, but they understand. They know who I am. They know that's just kind of the way I am. And you're right, they do. They do know that. But you know what? The things we do still hurt them. They suck it up. They say they're okay. They're not. And this is especially true as we deal with our families, right? That we actually think that just because we get along with our families or other relationships, that those relationships are healthy. There's a big difference between just getting along and having a relationship that's healthy enough where you actually have an active, positive influence in their lives, what we call moral authority. And a big part of establishing that and growing that is owning the damage that we've done and doing what we can to repair it. So the question I'd invite us all to answer is, who are the people in your life that you've hurt most? I'll answer mine. It's Bonnie. Right? My life was an utter mess for years. And she was always there. And I know from first-hand experience that saying sorry is not enough. What makes a difference is owning what you've done, recognizing there are some things you cannot fix, but there are some things that you can. And you do what you can. And you do it every day. And I can tell you straight away that no matter where you've been, what you've done, how it's gone, if you will follow that process, that relationship can go beyond just getting along. It can really start to thrive. But that change had to start with me, acknowledging that she wasn't good. Right? I had to own that. So let's all be willing to admit our mistakes, admit our failures. Right? Let's honestly look at the hurt we've caused, the damage we've done, and do what we can. So the challenge I put out to each of us is that this week, take some time, think about parts of your life that you kind of wish were different, and who got damaged and who got hurt, and pick one person, ideally the person that's most important to you, and begin this process. It certainly starts with I'm sorry, but then it goes to what damage did I really do? What can I fix? What can I fix? And then do the best we can along the way. And that will change everything. It will change your life. It will change all your relationships. And even if you're in a situation where the damage to a particular relationship is so bad, that person just will not accept your apologies, your attempts to fix it, a willingness to even try will make all the difference. When we are willing to step back, say, my relationships and the people in my life are more important to me than my pride, my position, or anything else that I have, and we're willing to own that, admit it, and do the work we can, It will change all of our relationships for the rest of our lives.